We're going to continue on in our Hall of Faith. Last week we were talking about Jacob, and we didn't quite get to finish, but we're going to go ahead and see if we can continue on with Jacob this week and see if we can wrap up with him with the Hall of Faith. And then I will have two more classes, this class and then next week. And then January starting, Donnie will be teaching you guys for about a month or so, and then I'll start back up again with the Hall of Faith after that. Uh, so let's go ahead and get started. We're going to continue on in the story of Jacob and looking at his life until he gets to the point in Hebrews chapter 11 where he's talked about in the Hall of Faith. So let's start with a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we have together to dive into your word and to look at it and to discuss it and to see how it applies to our lives. This is the day that you have made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. I pray that you continue to be with us as we study these lessons on faith. I pray that you help us to apply these to our lives and that we gain insight from what your Spirit has to say to each of us. I pray that you be with those who are traveling, bring them here safely. I pray for the rest of this service that everything that we do today is pleasing to your sight. Again, thank you for your Son who died on a cross for us, through which we have eternal life and that we can do all of these things. I ask this in your name. Amen. All right, so we're going to continue on with Jacob. Jacob, like we said last week, he's not like any of the previous people we've talked about in the Hall of Faith. He's not like Enoch, who walked with God, not like Noah, who found grace in the eyes of God, or Abraham or Isaac. The Bible picks up with most of these guys already kind of having an established relationship with God as their faith develops. But Jacob is not that. He came out of his mother's womb already fighting for his brother's position, grabbing at Esau's heel. He had no problems, Jacob, bending the rules and to manipulate to get his way and what he wanted. So he's not like the others in that regard. We know that his name means trickster or supplanter. Supplanter is one who takes the place of another or their title by force or strategy or strategic means, even illegal means. That's what that means, and that was Jacob's name. And as we said, names in the Old Testament, unlike today, where people just give you a name because they like the way it sounds, like put a junior on it, or I just like it. Names back then really gave you insight into who a person was or would be, and that was the name that was given to Jacob, trickster and supplanter. We won't go into the details like we did last week, but we know that Jacob, back in Genesis chapter 27, swindles his brother to get his birthright. And then, on top of that, impersonates Esau to steal his blessing, so that Isaac blesses him thinking that he's Esau. And we look at the blessing that Jacob gets, and we'll start there in Genesis chapter 27, verse 28 and 29. And this is Isaac talking to Jacob, thinking that that's Esau. May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. So really, this is the same blessing, almost word for word, that God gives Abraham when he blesses Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12. So it's almost the same blessing verbatim. So we can see that this same blessing is being passed from generation to generation. Abraham to Isaac, and then Isaac to Jacob. The problem with Jacob is he now has a blessing pronounced on him, that his character isn't ready for. And that's the problem. So although God always intended that Jacob was going to be the greater blessed of the two, both Jacob and Rebekah, they go about it the wrong way. I don't know if it reminds me of my life, and if you can think in your life, have you ever wanted the right thing, but tried to get it the wrong way? Anybody been there? Where you think this is something you want, I want this, and the opportunity is there for me, and you know what? I'm going to take it. Uh, and that's kind of where Jacob is. And sometimes that we can look at that and we kind of hard on Jacob looking at him and his life. But when we think about things in our lives, we kind of do the same things, maybe not to the degree, and maybe so. But maybe you even had the right intention in a situation, and wrong words came out instead, and then it ends up being worse off. Or maybe you trusted someone who's given you the wrong advice, like Rebekah did to Jacob, and it sets you back and messes your whole life up. But you still want the right thing. And like I said, God may be waiting and lining things up for us, but because we get impatient and we don't want to wait, we try to help God out almost in the way Sarah does in waiting for Isaac, and tries to help God and say, you know what, I'm going to just go ahead and go in there and sleep with Hagar, and we'll make this thing happen on our own. And when we're impatient in that way, it can set us back. It takes faith to wait on God. I know a lot of the times we think of stepping out, but after you step out, that's the hard part, is having to wait. Sometimes it may even seem like that's a harder thing to do than the actual stepping out, because once you're waiting, all sorts of things can creep in at that point. Doubt. Did I really hear God on this? What am I doing? Is this really the right way? And sometimes you think of waiting as an inaction, but it's really not. It actually takes faith to wait. Any thoughts on that before we move on? Okay, we'll move on from that. It almost reminds me. Here we go. Proverbs chapter 10. And actually, before we do that, it reminds me of, as we were saying just now, the prodigal son, as I'm thinking about that, where, we don't like to wait, and he asks for his inheritance, and he says, give me the inheritance right now. And Jesus, as he's giving that parable, he actually allows us to see what not waiting looks like in that regard, because it says he gave it to him. And God shows us in that story what it's like to receive something that may be good in and of itself, but you're actually not ready for. And so it actually turns out to be more harm than good when you get something that you're not ready for. So although Isaac blesses him, and he's not really blessed for the next 20 years or so, he gets taken advantage of by his uncle and swindled, and his uncle's a better con artist than he is. And so he kind of meets his match there, and he ends up spending 20 years getting taken advantage of. And so his life appears worse off with a stolen blessing than if he had never taken it. If he just waits on God, he gets the blessing with no heartache. We see Proverbs 10:22 here. It says, "The blessing of the Lord, it maketh rich, and he addeth no sorrow with it." You don't have to worry about consequences when God is ready to bless you, and you wait on him, and he gives it to you when you're supposed to receive it. Versus what Jacob did, not waiting, or Rebekah thinking the wrong person's getting it, and so we're going to take it into our own hands, and he has to deal with consequences. Did you have your hand up, Walter?
No, what I wanted to say was his uncle deceived them, but it was the practice of them days that if you had two daughters, it was the oldest one got married first, not the youngest. And even in today's culture, I had two sisters, and the youngest one got married earlier than she did. And she was happy for her sister, but she was sad because a lot of women think if the youngest one gets married, the other one's gonna be an old maid.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a practice of that day also.
It is a practice.
And so this is why he deceived the man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would have been nice for him to say that up front,
Yeah.
as opposed to these 7 years. But yeah, it was the practice. But he did still wait till after the 7 years to tell him. So and in those times, he did work the 14 years. But then the additional 6 years, he changes Jacob's wages 10 times. So he really works him over that during that time frame.
Also, the consequence of his sin, how he deceived his brother.
Mm-hmm.
The consequence of that sin, he too was deceived also.
Yes, exactly. And that's what follows him, which is. Oh, go ahead.
If you think of somewhere I've heard that there's a saying: if you get a bad result, what goes around comes around.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's happening to Jacob.
Yeah, yeah. And there's also in the Bible, God's not mocked. What a man sows, that will he reap. And I think that's where what goes around comes around actually stems from that piece in the Bible. And we usually always think of that in the bad sense, but it's in any phase of life, whatever you do, it comes back to you, and in a way even more so than how you sowed it, good or bad. So we don't have to worry about the consequences. And Jacob, in this case, was wanting, God was wanting to bless Jacob, but obviously he had to put Jacob through some changes first before that happened. His character had to change. Let's go to Genesis chapter 32 at this point. And so it says, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Now, Jacob is already alone at this point, scared, waiting for his brother Esau, who says he's going to kill him. He's left Laban at this point, and then this man just out of nowhere starts attacking him. Remember, it's dark. He has no idea who this man is. He probably thinks it might be Esau or one of his men, for all he knows, and he's alone. And I just, like we said last week, I think it's so interesting the way that God chooses to interact with Jacob here, and how he tries to do it with each one of us. You know, it's a burning bush with Moses. Abraham, it's a voice. Jacob is just coming to him as a man and just starts throwing him around. But God, you know, God has his way to deal with each one of us. And here, in this fight, you know, God is doing something to Jacob. He's basically breaking him down. There's no conniving, no quick thinking words that Jacob can say here to get him out of this. There isn't escape in that way. He's got to fight, and he's in a fight, and God deals with him in that way. Like we were talking just now with Walter saying, he's already been worked over by Laban. He's been running for his life from Esau, and now that he's all alone and afraid, he's being attacked. God is addressing his character, who Jacob is at his core. Genesis 32, verse 25. When the man saw he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. So this man touches Jacob's hip, and it becomes dislocated. That had to be pretty painful. At this point, Jacob is probably realizing he's not dealing with a regular man. After some research, looking at some research on hip replacements, the hip socket and the muscles in the hip socket are some of the strongest muscles in the human body. They're in place basically to protect the femur, which is one of the strongest bones in the body. And yet just the touch dislocates it. So if Jacob is fighting all night with this man, he's already tired, and then he has a dislocated hip. I would think he's probably, even at this point, not even able to stand as he's wrestling with this man. He's probably on his knees holding on to this man, as I would imagine if that would happen. So he's holding on for his life. Been worked over by Laban, running from his life from Esau. He's all alone, attacked, fighting for his life, and now even his self-sufficiency and being able to stand alone on his own 2 feet has been taken. He has been, in essence, stripped of everything. He's been broken. Now, in his brokenness, something happens. While being broken, he decides to hold on. The process God takes us through to change us may be painful. And I won't even say may, it usually is. Especially when it involves God trying to change something in our lives that we're not willing to look at or try to change. When God is ready to address our character, it's going to hurt. Sometimes in our lives, it will take being broken in a certain area or thought process before we can change. Hopefully, as we mature and grow in faith, it doesn't take that. But God has a way to deal with each of us in areas that we need to change in our lives. When those moments of brokenness happen in our lives, we really only have 2 options. We can either give up or we can hold on to God. Those are the 2 options you have when you're being broken, when you are broken, when there are times where you feel you can't make it, when you know you don't have it, where you know you're not enough. You either just give up or you hold on to God. Sometimes God creates the circumstances in our lives where we can't rely on the things that we thought we once could. Walter.
That reminded me of Saul on his way to Damascus, how God had to blinded him where he was completely helpless, for them to have a change that would come over, and then God would start to use it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes he has to strip us and break us down before he starts to build us back up again. And this is what he did here, and this is what he does with us sometimes. Sometimes we think that we can handle the situation ourselves, and God has to let us know in some ways harder than others, you don't have it. You may think you do, but you don't. And so the things we thought we could rely on, or people we thought we could rely on, all of a sudden are gone, and then it's just us with God. And in order to bring us closer to him, in order that for us really to realize that it's God that we need the whole time. Any thoughts before we move on? Yeah.
I like to look at it that he fought with God, okay? He wrestled with God, and he couldn't win. Okay, but that's how we struggle. We struggle, and we can't win. But also that God's will disabled him. And we have to remember that too. I mean, we struggle with a lot of things like Jacob did, and we got to realize that God's party, he knows what's going on. He wants to humble us. You know, how strong is your faith? You know, to realize that God can still handle any situation and still make it turn out to be right, his will.
Yeah, your faith is only as strong as how severely it's tested. You really don't know. And this was Jacob struggling with God. This was a tough one for him, but God basically just breaks him down, takes everything from him, so he's left completely alone. Once he's alone, he comes and wrestles with him, and then just strips him of everything. And really, that's the point of brokenness, is you being stripped of all your self-sufficiency and knowing that you don't have it. You're not enough for even you. You've got to depend on God, and that was the struggle. Everything that Jacob did to that point on was in his own power and getting it his own way by either conniving or scheming or doing it on his own. And here is the struggle or the wrestling with God, and God letting him know, you don't have it. Nancy?
But he wasn't willing, this is the part that's confusing me just a little. He says, then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. And Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he was still willing to hang on and fight there.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you, the man, of course, gives him the name Israel, and we know, what happens later. But, so he didn't really give up.
No, he's changed. He's broken. And as we said, I said there's two ways. You can either give up
Right.
or you can hold on to God. And so in this brokenness is how God changes his character. In this point where he's ready to give up, he decides rather than give up, I'm going to hold on. And so he does not give up. He says, I won't let you go. And so this is really the point that God really wants us at this point, where we either we either hold on or we just go our own way. Esau, when he couldn't get the blessing, went his own way and said, I don't want anything to do with God. Don't want it. But Jacob says, I'm still going to hang on. And at this point in his life, in this fight, he realizes this is not just a fight. This is about who he is. And he finally perceives that what he's been wanting his whole life, but has never quite been able to obtain, is right there, which is a blessing from God. And that means more to him than the pain he's going through with a dislocated hip. And he says, I won't let you go until you bless me. And he says here, like you said, let me go, for it's daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go until you bless me. And the man asked him, what is your name? We know the story of Jacob and the story about how he got his blessing by lying about his name. And now he's in front of God asking for a blessing, and God says, what's your name? He brings him right back to that point in his life and says, you know what? There's no skipping. There's no skipping steps with God. There's no A, B, C. You can't skip levels. Jacob tried to skip a level, but God brings him right back to it until he can pass it. Nancy?
But it's still conditional. I guess the point I'm trying to wrestle with is that he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. I mean, when we've gone, I've gone through turmoil, as all of us sitting in this room. And I never say, I'm not going to give up my will, Lord, unless you turn this thing around. It's just the language there that I'm wrestling with. Unless you bless me.
Right. You're listening to a man that is desperate at this point.
Yeah.
He is broken. He's willing to die. This is where he is in his life. He's never been able to get anything his way, even though he's got the blessing pronounced on him. But he's saying, even in my pain, I know who you are. I know this is not about a fight. And if I have to perish holding on to you to get a blessing from you, even though I know I don't deserve it, that's what I'm going to do.
It's just, I struggle. I would never say, well, I hope I would never say to God, I'm going to continue struggling with my will unless you turn this situation around. I guess for me, as a human being, I know the situation is different, and I just wrestle with the unless, because we're dealing with God.
Remember, he's wrestling with this man all night. If I wrestle with somebody for 15 minutes, I'm tired and ready to give up. He says, let me go, for it is daybreak. So during the rest of this lesson, he's wrestling. After Donnie's sermon, he's wrestling. After us driving home, he's wrestling. After us eating dinner, he's wrestling. He knows at this point, if God is really ready to kill him and he perceives who God is, that God would kill him. And God could kill him. He is really pleading to say, you know what? I've been wrestling with you all night until you bless me. And you can say that you wouldn't do it, but the fact of the matter is none of us really know where we are until we get to that point of desperation that we're willing to die for something in our lives. Jim?
I also take this as I'm willing to persevere.
exactly.
Not like, I know there's a blessing in there, right? And I'm willing to persevere until that blessing is brought forth.
Mhm.
Good chance.
Yeah, that's good. Go ahead, Todd.
Well, in the story, he's at a big marker point in his life
Mhm.
because all this time he's deceived his brother and he's done this bad thing to his brother and he's trying to reconcile with him. And it's like this is coming to a head right here, and this story mirrors what's happening with his brother.
Yeah.
He's doing all this stuff to even in the situation he's trying to make the whole situation so that his brother he gets the blessing from his brother. And here he's having this exact dream or whatever it is, vision, and he's trying to get the blessing from this stranger, and it seems like it's the same thing. And he realizes that if he doesn't get this blessing from his brother, that he's gonna get it. Whatever, I mean, this is, as the story goes, he's gonna get it. He's gonna do whatever he has to do to make his brother forgive him. And I mean, that's a valid thing, this kind of story kind of mirrors it.
Yeah, and yeah, he's at a head at this point, and really, this is actually where God wants him. And Jacob finally broken down when he says, "What is your name?" He's willing to acknowledge his name. He says, "I'm Jacob." He's basically saying, "Who are you?" This is what God's saying to him, and he's saying, "I'm a trickster. I'm a conniver. I've been this way my whole life, but I'm still holding on to you for a blessing, even though I know I don't deserve it. But I'm still holding on." And God's like, "You know what? That's what I've been waiting for you. Now I can bless you."
You been there?
Yep.
It makes me think of the persistent widow and the judge.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yes.
Where she
It shows you the heart of God.
just bugged him and bugged him and bugged him and said, "All right, I'll give you justice. Get away from him."
Mm-hmm.
And, well, that's my take on it. That's not.
It's right, and that judge was supposed to represent who God was, saying if that's who he was, and really this is the blessing that Jacob was supposed to receive, but because he tried to take it in an improper way, he couldn't receive it, and God was waiting for his character to get to this point to finally be able to take this blessing where he says, "Now I'm ready." But
When God is going to use you, he will test you. He knows you, but through that perseverance is when he'll test you to see how long you, and if you persevere, he says, "Now I'll be able to use you."
That's good, and yeah, his character had changed at that point, and this is what both Jacob and Rebekah didn't understand, was that it was always going to be he was always going to be the greater of the two brothers, blessed, no matter what Isaac did, because God chose him. And you see, Isaac pronounced him blessed, but he didn't receive the blessing because his character wasn't ready. God affirms him as a man as they're wrestling, and lets him know that being a man isn't able to stand on your own 2 feet, as this culture would tell you being a man is, but holding on to him. God affirms him, "I chose you," something that he had never received from his father Isaac, actually. The only affirmation he probably ever got from Isaac was who he wasn't, which was Esau. We know that Esau was Isaac's favorite. And so that had to be a tough thing even there. And God affirms him. And he says, because remember, even when Isaac is pronouncing the blessing on Jacob, Jacob knows that he thinks it's Esau. Doesn't think it's Isaac. And so he's not affirmed in that way, never really affirmed by Isaac in that way. But God does it for him in this moment of wrestling and reckoning. But not before Jacob is willing to get real with God. As I said last week, God doesn't change who you are until you can confess who you were. He comes right down to him and he says, "You know what? Are we going to play these games? Are you going to pretend? Are you going to try to swindle your way out of this one? Or are you going to be really real with me at this moment when I say, 'What's your name? Who are you really?'" And he tells him, and he's honest with him. And that's when God really is able to change us. It's only after Jacob wrestles and comes to terms with who he really is that God says, "Okay, now I can bless you." God doesn't change us until we drop the false pretenses with him. That's even in our own lives. We can't play those games with God like we do with people and just kind of cover who we are. Oh, everything's fine. I can put on my suit and look good or this and really not really have it. But that doesn't work with God. God who judges the heart and sees the heart. And especially as men, and I know there are women that do it too, but I think deep down with men, a lot of times, even thinking to myself, in a church setting, we may not say it, but we think when a situation happens, way down in the back of our minds, I can handle this. I got this. And we really think that sometimes, that we can handle our own situations. And we never reach that place that God really wants us to because we haven't really submitted deep down thinking that we have it. And then it takes God having to deal with us in that area, whatever it is. That's what God does with Jacob. And he puts Jacob as a man in circumstances that he really can't handle. Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. This is kind of comical to me. It's pretty funny. God definitely has a sense of humor in the way he responds to this. He's like, "Okay, you've been wrestling with me all night. You asked me to bless you. I changed your name to Israel, meaning one who strives with God, and you don't know who I am?" And he says, "Be blessed," and he leaves. That's it. He sort of gives, in today's terminology, sort of says, "Really? Really, Jacob?" Yeah. And he just says, "Be blessed." He says, "Who I am is in the name that I gave you. One who strives with God. Just concentrate on your new name, and you'll know who I am. Be blessed." And he leaves. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, "Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new." We can't keep our old name and walk with God. We can't keep our old identity and who we once were and walk with God. We've got to take on the newness of life as a new creature in God. Revelation 2 says, "And they were given new names." He says to Israel, or Jacob, "You are now Israel. You're no longer to be identified as a trickster, no longer a supplanter." I think about how good God is when he changes our names. When he can tell us that we're no longer who we thought we were. You're no longer that person that's not good enough. You're no longer inadequate. God doesn't see you the way people identify you. And now, for Jacob, he walks the rest of his life with a limp. But I don't think he minds it. Genesis 32:30. "So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, 'It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared.'" Yeah, Jacob's hip was dislocated, but every step he took from that point on was a reminder of his struggle with God. But it was also a reminder that he was blessed. He had finally gotten that blessing that he wanted. And every step he took in life, he knew he was blessed. Go ahead, Walter.
It reminds me of that phrase in the Bible that says, to he who much is given, much is required.
Mm-hmm. That's good. And he was given much after this. Jacob's an old man now, getting ready to die. Hebrews 11 says, "By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on top of his staff." And he's changed a lot from this point to where he was there. So much so now that he's actually able to speak wisdom and insight and prophecy into his children and grandchildren. He's blessing his grandchildren, and he's blessing the younger child with his right hand. And Joseph tries to move his hand out of the way. Remember, we just talked about this briefly last week when he makes his way to Egypt to Joseph. You usually bless the child, the older child, with your right hand, and then the younger one with your left. And so Joseph positions both of his children right next to Jacob, Manasseh, so that he was on Jacob's right hand and Ephraim on the left. But then Jacob switches his hands this way, and he blesses Ephraim, the younger, with his right hand, and Manasseh with his left hand. And Joseph is like, no, what are you doing? And he tries to move his father's hands to put the right hand on the older child, and Jacob says no. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger brother will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations. Jacob now has prophetic insight into the future and tells Joseph that his younger son is going to be greater than the older. And we seem to see this reoccurring theme throughout, where the older serves the younger. We see it with Jacob and Esau. We see it also with David, the youngest of his brothers. And God just doesn't always follow tradition. It's God's decision, and he has insight, and he sees this in the same way that he did. The following chapter, he also speaks into the lives of his children and pronounces blessing and inheritance for each of them and how they'll be affected in the future. You see, true blessing is walking in God's divine plan for your life. True blessing is the ability for a father to pass on divine favor to his sons because he's giving them the direction that God wants them to head. And he's able to do that, and that's what the blessing is as it's passed from person to person. Part of that favor was revealing prophetically who they would be, the direction they would go, the lands they would inherit or conquer, in essence, what their purpose would be. All that was tied up in the blessing. So if you find your God-given purpose in life, you're blessed. If you were to reverse engineer that, some would say someone who is not blessed, or cursed rather, is somebody who walks their entire life never finding out their true God-given purpose and walking in it. That's somebody who is not blessed. Never knowing what they're here for, never knowing God's direction, never seeing it, never finding it. That is that. So if God calls a custodian in order to one day reach people that no one else can reach, so that someone else can reach them, and he walks in that custodian is blessed. He's fulfilled. He'll live a fulfilled life, more so than the pop star who seems to have all the money in the world and is not fulfilled. How many times have we seen these people, or rock stars or pop stars, and they end up killing themselves because even though they've got money, they're not fulfilled. They're like, is this it? And they don't have a purpose. And so they can't find it. So having wealth doesn't mean that you're blessed. It to me is why the prosperity gospel, as they call it, it is so damaging to what the true blessing of God really is. They have it as the nice car, the big bank account, and the large home. And so what will happen is they'll get a large following of people chasing those things and coming to God to get those things, only to seek what God can give them and not God himself. And so when those things go, so do they. Don't misunderstand me here. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with being rich or having nice things or having a nice house. Isaac was extremely wealthy. Abraham was wealthy. Job was the richest man in the East. But that wasn't why they were blessed. They were blessed as a result of seeking God. And as a result, material wealth was just an addition. They chased God, not things. And those things are nice if you have them, and it's a blessing to have them, but those things in and of themselves are not the blessing. The true blessing of God is not just for you. It always goes beyond your life. If we look at the way they all get blessed, the blessing moves beyond the children and the grandchildren. When Jacob and when God introduces himself to people in the Old Testament, he always says, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Father, son, grandson. A godly man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. Father, son, grandson. Goes beyond your life. True blessings will always go beyond your life, not just for you in the here and now. That's God's purpose. Another noticeable change, we'll get ready to wrap up here, is in Jacob, or rather Israel, is noted in Genesis chapter 49, when he's getting ready to be buried. He's telling his sons where to bury him after he's blessed them and has directed them each their blessings and some curses. He says, the cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. And there I buried Leah. Remember, Leah was the one that was unloved. But his character changes, and he sees her the way that God finally sees her. And he says, my grandparents Abraham and Sarah are buried there. My parents Isaac and Rebekah are buried there. There is where I've buried Leah. Bury me with her. He buries her in the place of honor. Not Rachel. Rachel is not buried there. He doesn't choose to be buried with Rachel. He chose to be buried with Leah. He finally sees her for who she really is. One way you can know that God changes you is in how you treat people. People that you don't perceive can benefit you. People that you don't, how do you treat those people? And we see that with him. We know that the lineage of the Messiah comes through Leah, not Rachel. Personal note, my daughter Rhea's name is the combination of both Rachel and Leah. I wanted her, obviously, to be beautiful like Rachel, but I wanted her to have the inward resolve of Leah when things didn't go her way. It's tough. She's had a hard life, but she prays, and Leah prays to God, and Leah sees, and God sees Leah for who she is, and blesses her, and that's what you see here. What a change in character from Jacob. As Jacob the trickster, he's not able to see her, but as Israel, he can see her, and he's able to put her in perspective to things in the future, as well as when he blesses his sons and his grandchildren. That's legacy. That's what legacy does. Let's be encouraged and walk in that way. That's the legacy of faith. He starts out as a trickster and ends in the hall of faith. All right, we'll end there. Let's have Nick end us in prayer.
Our Heavenly Father, we're so thankful to hear the stories of Jacob again and remember what a great man he was and he turned out to be. We're thankful for the example that he set, especially of faith.